Be strong.
Hey guys, it's Andrew. Welcome back. Today I wanted to go over something that I've been asked about a lot, and it's celiac disease, gluten intolerance, going gluten-free, basically all of the gluten type questions that I, talk to people about and get asked quite frequently. So let's start with celiac. So I'm pretty familiar with celiacs as I was diagnosed almost 20 years ago. Back at that point, they only had a simple antibody test, an anti-gluten antibody test. And, I had been having health issues for a couple of years at that point, and so I got the test done. Of course, I came back positive, and that was really like a watershed moment for me, right? So like up until this point, I had seen a bunch of doctors, my GP, gastroenterologist, a neurologist, an ENT, like a bunch of different doctors trying to figure out like, why do I have, neurosymptoms? Why do I have chronic fatigue and like all of this, these issues? Why do I have chronic indigestion? All of this stuff. And getting diagnosed with celiac was really the first time that I had like hope. I had something to target. I had something that the doctors could say, okay, this is something wrong, because prior to that, every time I went to a doctor, they're just like, you're a healthy young man. Like, you just need to eat a little better or sleep a little more, right? It's like the most frustrating thing in the world. And I'm sure a lot of you have had similar experiences, even now with, health and autoimmune diseases becoming much more prominent in our society, and like our doctors being more aware about all of these different conditions that they're not typically taught in medical school, but nonetheless affect a large number of people these days. So yeah, it was a really big moment getting diagnosed with celiac disease. It was something that I could look at and research, and the treatment for it was going gluten-free, which I had no idea what that meant back in the day, right? And my diet at that point was very glutinous and very terrible, right? Like I would eat, pizza rolls and cheesesteaks and pizza and mac and cheese and like all this stuff, and candy basically, and soda, right? Like that was my diet. It's a pretty typical American diet, and it's pretty bad for you. So going gluten-free, it took a while, right? I had to figure out what foods were gluten-free, because there wasn't any, no gluten-free alliance or whatever, no gluten-free certification markings on anything. No restaurants had gluten-free menus at that point. So it's really, like a minefield, basically. Whenever I went out to eat at any restaurant, I would try and pick something on the menu that didn't seem glutinous, and hopefully it wasn't, contaminated while it was being cooked. Or hopefully, they didn't put like, wheat flour as like a thickening agent in like mashed potatoes or something, which definitely happened a few times. So yeah, I mean, still half the time when I went out to eat, I would have issues. And but now, it's much better now, right? Like there's even entirely gluten-free restaurants, which are amazing. So people with gluten issues now have things a lot better. And what I eventually ended up discovering was that Mexican food is largely gluten-free. The majority of stuff that comprises Mexican food is very gluten-free. And so I just started having Mexican food for every meal. Well, not breakfast, but pretty much every meal. I mean, it was about the time that Chipotle started becoming a thing, and I had like a double meat Chipotle for lunch and dinner, like every day for a decade. True story. Like, I literally spent thousands and thousands of dollars at Chipotle. But it was amazing, right? I mean, Chipotle is really good food, so I don't exactly regret that. But yeah, it could have been healthier. So this kind of brings me to what I really wanted to talk about here, right? And, the questions that I get asked a lot are, who should go gluten-free? Why do you go gluten-free? That kind of stuff. And really, I think this kind of breaks down into like three groups of people, right? It's like the people with celiac disease, the people who have gluten intolerance, and then everyone else. And so for people with celiacs like myself, right, you have to go gluten-free forever, right? I mean, your body has a strong antibody response to any gluten-containing food, and it triggers an autoimmune reaction, and that, causes destruction of your gut and damage to your nervous system and to other organs in your body, and can even end up in death. So you really don't want to eat gluten, and it really has to be a lifelong thing. Like, there's no experimentation and reintroduction of gluten later on, because the antibody reaction that you have doesn't tend to go away. I'm not saying it can't go away. I haven't seen studies where people who tested positive for celiac disease magically no longer had celiac disease again after like 5 years or 10 years trying to reintroduce gluten, right? So we might figure out a way to do it sometime in the future. It's not going to happen right now. Don't count on it. But for the second group, there's a bit more hope, right? So people with gluten intolerance, there's a couple different things in gluten to be intolerant to. I mean, some people are intolerant of grains in general. Some people are intolerant of fructans. Some people are intolerant of the lectins in it. Some people are intolerant of just the glyphosate. And that kind of ties into the third reason as well. But for people who are gluten intolerant, you can experiment with gluten, right? So people who are intolerant tend to have an IgG antibody response, which is milder than the IgA that you typically have in celiac disease. So for people with gluten intolerance, that response tends to go down over time, especially if your digestion improves. So, if you go on you adhere to a gluten-free diet for a while, you can try reintroducing gluten later on, see how you react to it, see if things get better over time, right? Hopefully that your body repairs itself, your immune system calms down, and then you're better able to tolerate gluten and everything. And so for those people, right, the removal of gluten from your diet is a temporary thing. It's usually like 2 weeks or 30 days, or you can even try a longer exclusion period, so like 6 months or a year, if the shorter exclusion periods aren't giving you the benefit that you want. And so that's really, I think, where a lot of people, where that question comes from a lot of people, right, is like they have some indigestion of some kind. They obviously don't have autoimmune disease or not a manifest, clinical autoimmune disease yet. And so they just want to be healthier. They want to know if, gluten is healthier. And so for, anyone with GI symptoms or weird symptoms that the doctor doesn't have a good reason for, try going gluten-free. You could have, low-lying gluten intolerance, and you could feel better from not eating it. And so that kind of also ties into the third group, which is every other human being, right? And so, I mean, I'm kind of joking about that, but kind of not, right? And so the reason why is that gluten, along with other grains, are generally bad for you for two primary reasons. One, they have a really high amount of glyphosate for the size of, or like the amount of food you're getting, right? So any grain, right, basically takes in a lot of the glyphosate that is sprayed on the plants. Whereas, a larger fruiting plant or a larger vegetable will have less glyphosate per for the mass, right? So you can eat a lot more vegetables or fruits and get a lot less exposure to glyphosate for the most part. And glyphosate is terrible for you, not in the direct sense as it will poison you directly, but so it disrupts something called the shikimate pathway in bacteria. And as we were discovering, you have bacteria everywhere. It's in your gut, it's in your nose, it's in your brain, it's everywhere, right? And so there's actually bacteria and fungus and viruses in every cell in your body. And even mitochondria, which power every cell in your body, used to be bacteria. So like, So disruption of the shikimate pathway disrupts your microbiome or your holobiome, which is generally your microbiome for your whole body, right? Because it has the ability to kill off a lot of the healthy symbiotic bacteria that live inside of you. And when that happens, it predisposes you to disease. So the more gluten you eat, the higher your disposition for disease, the higher, the amount of glyphosate you intake, the more that glyphosate has the potential to disrupt a healthy microbiome that you could currently have, and then the higher you increase your risk for disease. And so that combined with the second part of gluten that can be an issue, which is lectins, something popularized by Dr. Gundry in his Plant Paradox book. Basically, lectins are the defense mechanism of plants versus predators. And in some types of plants, like grains and legumes, the amount of lectins are really high. And some beans are high enough that they can cause very serious toxicity and poisoning if you eat the beans, if they're not like pressure cooked. But in grains, they're also very high. So in gluten, you're getting a lot of lectins. And the way that we used to get around that, the lectins in gluten, is we used to make sourdough, and that was how nearly all bread was made back in the day. It was all sourdough, and sourdough, the process of fermenting the dough eats a lot of the gluten, or a lot of the lectins that are in the dough, and so we would have much less glutinous dough. So if you want to reduce your overall lectin count while still maintaining gluten in your diet, you go for sourdough, right? Because sourdough is going to have much fewer or a much lower lectin count than bread of other types that are not fermented. So, between lectins and really high glyphosate count, it really just makes grains in general, including gluten, gluten just being one of the most prevalent, just bad for you, right? It's, really unfortunate because gluten is incredibly tasty. I mean, I used to eat gluten, before I was diagnosed with celiac, and so I still remember and salivate at the taste occasionally. So I totally understand it's a really difficult thing to get rid of, and that's why I was joking earlier about every single person in the world should probably not have gluten, because I don't see it ever happening. I don't see enough people actually caring about killing off some of their healthy bacteria to eat pizza and all of this stuff that they want to eat that's very glutinous, right? And so, it's really for people that really care about their health, really care about their longevity and their risk of disease, and especially if you already have autoimmune disease of some kind, lowering or eliminating gluten in your diet and then all grains in general can be really beneficial. It certainly was in my case, and it's been in the case of a lot of people that I talk to. So definitely something to consider if you have a lot of health issues, or you just want to be healthier in general, right? You go gluten-free. And so I think those are the three major groups that tackle a lot of the questions that I get about celiac disease, gluten intolerance, and going gluten-free. So yeah, I'm going to be diving into gluten-free a little bit deeper in my diet section, where I go over gluten-free diets, of which there are many varieties, and there's some very specialized ones for autoimmune diseases that I've personally tried out and have tweaked and everything. So I'm going to be detailing that quite a bit in those videos. And so hopefully that clarified a lot of any issues or questions that people have surrounding celiac disease and gluten intolerance and going gluten-free. If you have any more questions or comments, definitely leave them below. Otherwise, thanks for watching, guys, and have a good one.